So good afternoon or good morning, based on where you're calling from today. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm really delighted to be chairing this book launch as part of the HUMA series, which is a space for critical conversations on scholarship that is produced on the African continent by Africans and about Africa. And today we are joined by Professor Francis Nyamnjoh, who personally I had the opportunity to read in my first year of undergrad in a decoloniality reading group. And I think we read Potted Plants in Greenhouses. And I've kept thinking about that for since then. And it's been, I think, 5 years or 4 years already. So for those who don't know Professor Francis, he's a professor of social anthropology at the University of Cape Town after being at the Council for the Development of Social Science Research in Africa, known as CODESRIA, in Dakar, Senegal, where he served as head of publications from 2003 to 2009. He has taught sociology, anthropology, and communication studies at the universities of Cameroon and Botswana, and has also researched and written extensively on Cameroon and Botswana. And his scholarly books include Africa's Media, Democracy and the Politics of Belonging, Insiders and Outsiders, Citizenship and Xenophobia in Contemporary Southern Africa, C'est l'homme qui fait l'homme, Cul-du-sac Ubuntuism in Côte d'Ivoire, and Roads Must Fall, Nibbling at Resilient Colonialism in South Africa, which was published in 2016. And which is the center of our conversation today. The book, as we will hear from Professor Nyamnjoh, is about rights, entitlement, and citizenship in post-apartheid South Africa, and demonstrates the ways in which racism and its benefits persist. So the aim of today's book launch is to make it as conversational as possible and to sort of break the standardized flow. Please do raise your hand to ask a question through the Zoom option. We will first begin by hearing from Professor Nyamnjoh, and from our discussants, we're joined by Shannon Moreira and Kat Leho, who both have engaged extensively with the works of Professor Nyamnjoh and more precisely on the book, and we will hear from them. And then we will be opening for a Q&A. Professor Nyamnjoh, I won't speak anymore. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Amin. It's a pleasure to be part of this conversation. I really adore conversations, and especially on such a challenging theme like roads must fall, and on such a human being as Cecil Rhodes, who defies easy categorizations. Because as you note from the book, his person and experiences pose a problem that is common to us all. The idea of what makes us human. And I think that my introductory remarks, I would like to present a few categories under which we could appreciate and relate to Rhodes as a phenomenon, as a person, and then as a phenomenon, and what lessons we draw on our knowledge of him to inform our aspiration for the future. And the first thing I think that we have to bear in mind is how Rhodes reminds us a lot about what is true of most of us humans, in fact of every human, is our reality of incompleteness. The idea that as humans, even the most endowed, often we have to go into the realm of fiction to begin to understand how humans can compensate for their incompleteness by developing attributes always in surplus. And that digression is important. If you read some fictional accounts from the continent, you see how much we try to grapple with the idea of incompleteness. For example, one of the authors that I've studied in this regard is the late Nigerian novelist and writer Amos Tutuola, whose novels are like fantasy spaces where humans go to compensate for incompleteness by seeing through their encounters with creatures of various kinds that remind them about how you could activate yourself through relationships with others. And uh, 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 so incompleteness is a very a central aspect of this book, and it is that awareness of incompleteness that push people to to engage, to activate their mobility, to become mobile. And it's almost as if mobility is responsible for all the sins of the world. Yet, if without mobility, even us who sit in judgment about the sins of others would not be available to do that. So mobility is an essential ingredient of our realities as humans, because we all are aware of our various incompletenesses and seek to mitigate them through various forms of mobility. So at the heart of this book is the idea of incompleteness, and immediately followed by that of mobility as a way of looking for ways for inspirations to enable us go beyond our incompleteness and seek fulfillments of various kinds. And as would happen, whenever you move or whenever you activate your mobility, you encounter others because you don't have the monopoly of incompleteness. Cecil Rhodes did not have the monopoly of incompleteness. He traveled to Southern Africa and realized that he wasn't the first to be there. There were others who, in their various incompletenesses, were also equally very mobile in the region and seeking to fulfill themselves through encounters with one another. So you then realize that you don't have a monopoly of mobility, but something comes in here is that what motivates us to seek to enhance ourselves through mobility is not necessarily the same for each and every one, or each and every subgroup, or each and every cultural community. Some move around with the idea that you could do away with your incompleteness completely by reaching out and conquering others, whether you conquer them as fellow humans, or you conquer the environment, or you conquer whatever other aspects that in your quest to undo incompleteness. So some believe that incompleteness is a temporary thing, and you can overcome it through mobility and conquest. And often in would you harness technology which you believe is superior technology, and you dominate others who do not quite have the same technology as you. But as you notice from the Rhodes book, such a belief or such a mindset is an extravagant illusion. it just what it does is that it simply produces a cycle of violence and violation, and your illusions or delusions of completeness come at a very heavy cost to your own humanity and the humanities of those that you disparage and in your pursuit of this illusion of completeness. What you also notice is that not everybody who moves around shares that belief that incompleteness is a transient state, or that it can be undone. You also realize how when others, and it's interesting that we are dealing here with Southern Africa, where uh, there are philosophies of personhood and of relationships that remind us that not everybody believes or invests in the extravagance of completeness being possible. And philosophies such as Ubuntu and not as a zero-sum game, but being in an inclusive way, being and belonging as an inclusive exercise that is permanently open to taking others in as a way of enriching ourselves and equally enriching others. So it's a productive encounter in this regard, with nobody wanting absolute victories and absolute in the quest for completeness. So I thought, although incompleteness is normal for everyone, not everybody thinks that accepts it as such, and some invest in the idea that completeness is possible, and you can acquire it through all sorts of maneuvers and manipulations, including conquest, violence, and violation. Another thing which the book reminds us about is that depending on the philosophy of the motivation for your one's mobility, one then reaches situations of encounters of different sorts. And the one in this book is the what sort of encounters are possible when one is driven by the idea that completeness is possible. And you see unequal encounters, a way of defining and trivializing the humanity of others as you overly dramatize your own and your importance and so on. So it introduces hierarchies in situations where it is very much possible to reimagine power and relationships not in zero-sum fashions, but as subject contextual. I think that is something that we learn from the book. Another thing we learn from the book is also the idea of debt. When because we are incomplete and we always move around to enhance ourselves, we find out that we get indebted, and just as others are indebted to us, we exchange as a way of being able to maximize our existence, and that entails debt and indebtedness. And in Ubuntu circles, the idea of debt and indebtedness is very cleverly dealt with, in that my success depends on those who have propped me up, and I owe them a debt of propping them up in turn, if not directly, but things, others that are connected to them. But the idea of the pursuit of completeness however wrong, misguided that might be, creates the impression that one can ignore or forget about one's debt, or turn the tables on the philosophy and logic of debt and indebtedness, where those that one have deprived of what belongs to them are presented as if they were indebted to one. So again, depending on what motivates your mobility, you can actually get this warped notion of who is indebted to whom. And again, the Southern African context where Ubuntu operates reminds us of the humility that life is a series of debt and indebtedness and things like that. So I think that comes through in the book as well. And equally, from the book is the idea of conviviality, which I play around with. But it is a conviviality that presupposes a recognition and the provision for incompleteness. It is not conviviality where completeness is possible. It is conviviality built, founded on the idea of incompleteness as a norm, incompleteness as a universal. And as usual, Rhodes is a fascinating subject contemplate on, and he opens up a lot more doors for one to reflect on current developments, whether in Africa or elsewhere in the world. Even you'll be amazed by how much you could draw from Rhodes to understand someone like Donald Trump and the like. So I will end there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor. I think you've given us a lot to think with, and I really look forward to hearing what both Shannon and Katleho have to say. So I would like to invite Shannon to begin first, and then we'll be joined by Katleho. Shannon, the floor is yours.
So much. It's it's an absolute pleasure to be here today, speaking about this wonderful book and speaking more broadly about Prof. Nyamnjoh's work. So I think to begin with the book, because that's where we are. This book really, as Francis has said, has at its center a man and his symbolism, and then moves out from there to much wider ideas. So Cecil John Rhodes, his statue that previously stood in the grounds of UCT, and then what he most recently came to represent during the nationwide student protests of 2015 and 2016. And so one of the things that Francis tells us in the book is, and I quote, a monument, however imbued with symbolism, cannot capture everything wrong with the country. But nonetheless, using the statue and its subject, using Rhodes as a core theme, really allows Prof. Nyamnjoh to build a very historically informed commentary on contemporary South Africa and its relationality and its lack of relationality, I think, to the wider African region. So I really feel like this is a book that you finish with a very deep understanding of some of the discourses that organize daily life and public culture in contemporary post-apartheid South Africa. And I think for myself, one of the most powerful points of this book is its detailed documentation of what it means in practice to emerge from the trauma of apartheid, the trauma of colonization, and the forms of categorization that the Prof was just speaking us through. So Nyamnjoh draws on Ben Okri to highlight the very urgent temporality that characterizes post-colonial nation building, such that we go from tearing down the unacceptable to building the desirable without a break in the dance. So the 1994 settlement in South Africa, the ensuing TRC, we're reminded by this book, were not intended as an endpoint, but as a starting point. So really as enabling the beginning of a tentative new mutuality, a tentative new conviviality perhaps in the country. And the student protests around which this book emerged in 2015, 2016, really show us the failures of those ensuing processes of restitution. So I sort of feel that reading this book is to take a break in the post-colonial dance. And it gives us some moments in which to ask some very hard questions of contemporary South Africa. Sometimes the questions that it raised for me sort of felt almost unthinkable. Questions that were very deeply informed by Francis Nyamnjoh's knowledge of wider African studies for decolonization. And that really opened up the sorts of debates that were happening in South African universities at the time. So if we think through race, for example, which has obviously been central within South Africa and continues to be central within South Africa, and is really enfolded in social class, such that in South Africa, the intersection of class and race seldom hides for long. But this book reminds us of other forms of being, other ways of being in the world, where we can think about race as one attribute among many, and particularly where identity and citizenship are never complete, but are always in becoming in relation to those around us. And I think the message there is that to rethink that which we have inherited takes humility as well as courage and creativity. And the moment at which this book was published, those messages really mattered. So for myself as a colleague at the University of Cape Town, I think those messages really mattered within the sort of collegiality of UCT, but obviously also out into wider society as a whole. The one chapter that I just want to hone in on to finish up my response here is actually the opening chapter on Rhodes himself. And the reason I want to do that is that in some of his earlier work, Francis has argued that whiteness in South Africa has tended to be under-researched and under-articulated, particularly within anthropology, but across the social sciences as a whole. And I think this book takes on the challenge in some very interesting ways and takes a deep dive into how whiteness has come about in South Africa and what it means in the present. So what the book shows us through very careful historical research is how the hierarchies of and within whiteness and blackness that we live with in South Africa today have emerged from a particular moment in history, a particular moment of conquest. And the chapters are a really powerful reminder of why we need to dig deep into those histories to think of ways to change the present. So for the last few years, I've really been recommending this book to white colleagues, to white friends in South Africa and beyond, as I think it gives a very essential interrogation of whiteness as it exists here in this place, in Cape Town in particular. And it serves as an entry point into some of the very hard conversations that often don't happen. So UCT, for example, has now taken some formal steps towards articulating whiteness, asking through its Office for Inclusivity and Change that white colleagues do the work of decentering whiteness at the institution, rather than leaving it to Black colleagues alone, which is obviously a welcome move, but nonetheless, there's a lot of work left to do at an institution and national level if we want to move towards these sorts of incompleteness, ideas of Ubuntu, debt and indebtedness, so that we are able to work towards mutuality rather than difference in South African public culture. So Nyamnjoh also reminds us in the book that it may be up to every South African to be the change to which they aspire. However, that change can only come about if whites and whiteness as epitomes of privilege and supremacy in South Africa move from quibbles and rhetoric to substantive gestures of inclusivity through significant recirculation of wealth. And that's a quote from page 207 in the book. Yeah, so I suppose where I want to end today is just to think 5 years on from the initial publication of this book, in the middle of a global pandemic, which has really highlighted the inequalities present within South African society. So I'm left wondering if the pandemic has given us any impetus towards conviviality, towards mutuality, or if it's driven South Africans even more deeply into the ever diminishing circles of inclusion that this book highlights as part of our colonial heritage. And it seems clear that the work of decolonization in South Africa, both in terms of hierarchies that exist inside our heads, but also the social realities that have come to accompany those imaginaries, it seems clear that that kind of decolonization can't be done without some sort of significant economic redress. And there's a lot of talk at the moment, for example, about the introduction use basic income grant in South Africa to afford a dignified life to all. And so I'm wondering if the Prof would be willing to reflect on his views on what the urgency created by the pandemic has done to our essential humanness in South Africa. Are we any closer towards goals of inclusivity? Or are we still in a very, in a very narrow place where South Africa is maintaining its narrow notions of citizenship? So, for example, would a basic income grant accept the basic humanity of migrants, or is it going to be something that, that doubles down on nationality? So yeah, in sum, I think the book really reminds us that the categories we live by and with don't necessarily have to be real if we have the courage to think and act past them. And that any rhetoric of decolonization, which was so prevalent at the time that this book was written, really needs to widen beyond zero-sum binaries. Citizens versus Makwere, for example, if it is to succeed. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Shannon. Perhaps I'd like to give the floor to Katleho, and then we move back to you, Professor, to respond to the two discussants. Katleho, if you could please unmute yourself. You are already unmuted.
Yes. Good evening, Professor Nyamnjoh. Good evening, everyone who's, well, it's good afternoon, actually. So I'm just going to give a few thoughts, and I think I have more questions than I do a bigger thought. But reading this book, and admittedly, I only read this book a few months ago, and I think it was wonderful to reflect back on Rhodes Must Fall. The book reads as an assemblage of many really big arguments that in themselves feel like they could be grappled with in a few books, not even just one. But what I appreciated is that the book came together as almost a meeting point for several really expansive topical themes, and it grappled within post-colonial South Africa. So ideas of belonging, decolonization, race, mobility, and hierarchies, especially of humanity, that many people are still doing the work of thinking through in different contexts now. These are the central themes, and there are many other sub-themes that I think that I would enjoy seeing Professor Nyamnjoh expand on, and I've seen some of his work do this. What I appreciated is this use of 2015 as a moment. So a moment, not saying that there haven't been other moments where this layered colonization still raises its head, but it becomes this moment of seeing the contradictions that are taking place within South Africa, some of them reinforcing of colonization, and some of them being moments where colonization is being grappled with and well, we're trying to detangle. A few times in the first two chapters of the book, when Professor Nyamnjoh reinforces this grand idea of Rhodes, I was worried, reinforcing him as this like self-made, powerful, Africa-taming British imperialist. And in that moment, because this is also such a big task, I think, I found myself wondering if the book actually needed to be hinged on Rhodes Must Fall movement at all. But and is the exploration of foreignness and therefore citizenship enough to show the stubbornness and exclusionary nature of colonialism? And it's in actually chapter 3, Not Every Black is Black Enough, that Professor Nyamnjoh then answers the question by making that really strong correlation between xenophobia and the student protests clearest, I think. I think that chapter makes that argument clearest. And in this chapter, Professor Nyamnjoh then, in the book, then we can better understand the interrogation of this as a moment, right? Where intersecting temporalities can clearly be witnessed as simultaneously forming, contesting, and reinforcing hierarchies. So there's one quote on page 116, where Professor Nyamnjoh says the cigarette of Black South African modernist ambitions was lit from both ends. The cigarette was lit on one end, that of impoverished masses, by burning hurdles posed by an ever-surging influx of amakwerekwere, the present-day Homo cadis. Please excuse my pronunciation. Tailmen, cavemen, primitives, savages, barbarians, or Hottentots who are desperately seeking to graduate from Heart of Darkness north of Limpopo following the end of apartheid. It was lit on the other end, that of emerging Black middle classes, by the inconvenience of resident Amakwerekwere of yesteryear, who had remained like the residue of a purportedly fallen apartheid to continue to thwart Black dreams of good life inspired by whiteness, and for which they have aspired since first contact with whites. And from here, this is where I would like to ask a question. And I'd like to, perhaps it's not a question, but it's just thinking through of practical ways of manifesting this idea of flexible citizenship, but also both taking into account how the cigarette is lit on both sides, right? And taking into account that sometimes it is not even the same cigarette that's being lit for the same South Africans. So I'd like to just think through what we imagine some of the practical ways of manifesting flexible citizenship and untangling our own imaginations and experiences of ourselves from fixed identities. Because in reaching back into history, it is easier then to see how the fixedness of identities is a making of identities, right? That it's not really fixed, it's an illusion of fixed identities. But even in that, the illusionary fixed identities do work in South Africa. Very recently in Soweto, and there have been many occurrences, there was Operation Dudula, where the idea was for Soweto to be, for the businesses in Soweto to be businesses owned and run by firstly legalized Black citizens, what Professor Nyamnjoh calls sons and daughters of the soil, right? Which I also absolutely love, because it then plays with these ideas that Pan-Africanists have, and how do you become Pan-Africanist and Pan-African xenophobic and one? But also we can't get away from the real felt experiences that come with economic pressures, with social pressures. And I'm trying to figure out how then we start this process of practically reimagining ourselves. Before going on too far, what I really actually enjoyed as well is how the book is written as provocations, especially through questions and this like subtle satire and inverting of language. For instance, the book uses the term sons and daughters of the soil, as I've already mentioned, but also this idea of white amakwerekwereness. I'm still grappling with the white idea of amakwerekwere. And thinking about this idea of could it work that we actually imagine whiteness in terms of makwerekwereness, and what does that do? Does it reinforce the idea of makwerekwereness, therefore not belonging, or does it do the work of provoking but also moving past that provocation? And I suppose I would like to then end with one thought. I have many thoughts, but I'd like to end with another thought, which is this idea of incompleteness, this incomplete humanity. And Professor, I think I've mentioned to you a few times my discomfort with, in this moment now, using ideas of incompleteness when we know that African identity is often associated with lacks. Are we in a moment where we can start using this idea to think of ourselves as incomplete? And yes, we understand interdependent, but is it not perhaps maybe too soon to start thinking of ourselves as incompleteness? Are we ready is really the question. I'd like to end it there, and then maybe a little bit at the end when other people have come in and you've answered, maybe we can have a discussion about other things. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Katleho, and thank you, Shannon. I think you've laid the basis for a great conversation. And I would like to invite Professor Nyamnjoh to perhaps respond to Shannon and Katleho before we can engage with participants who have joined us today. And I think it's really interesting to weave the contemporary, as you said, to larger discourses on citizenship and widening flexible citizenship. And I think that in as much as the conversation is very contextual about South Africa, a lot of us who are not part of this space and who are not familiar with it as much can have a lot to borrow from to think about our own respective countries on the continent. Professor Nyamnjoh, the floor is yours to respond. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amina, and thanks a lot, Shannon and Katleho, for doing Cecil Rhodes this great service. I think he would be he would feel honored wherever he is at the moment. You know, he has this capacity to be present in various fragments in multiple places all at the same time. That's the strength of someone like Rhodes, which makes him a phenomenon, and a very provocative phenomenon in that regard. And he also has the capacity of coming under different guises and disguises, sometimes with a name like Katleho, or with a name like Nyamnjoh, or with a name like Shannon. So he has this capacity just to be a trickster. And many of such people in history are able to maneuver and manipulate in precisely those terms, which is why when I started studying writing on Rhodes Must, I decided to write on Rhodes Must Fall. The question that I had was basically the questions of the person and the question of what that person symbolized. And in many ways, Rhodes symbolized to me somebody who came from a group of people and he himself being having his own personal ambitions, but identifying with a group of people who believed that completeness was possible, and that you could attain a superior status or some sort of supremacy just by your capacity to be nimble-footed and to get the best of all worlds. And then you can then build an empire, you can build a conglomerate, whatever. That's how companies and big projects are made. So, and I said to myself that history is the product of our our actions as humans, human action. And if Rhodes represented that in the context where he came from, the UK or Britain at the time, reaching out to Southern Africa, how could I use Rhodes' story as a template for being able, or a prism for being able to understand similar developments elsewhere, who may not necessarily be called Rhodes, who may not necessarily come from the UK or from Southern Africa. Maybe Amina from Morocco, being able to relate what we're saying about Rhodes in her own context. So how do human experiences, human examples serve just like as examples for others to draw on? Now, don't get carried away by the detail. It's in that sense that I appealed to the notion of flexible citizenship. And that flexible citizenship is only possible, it's not possible in a context where completeness is taken seriously, even if once in a while it materializes itself, as in the example of Soweto you gave us, or elsewhere. You are in the US at the moment. If you are lucky that you are not under Trump, so he's just left office. But if you were there and he got up with one of those his tweets, he might tweet you out of the US. And however much you claim flexible citizenship and belonging, he could undo your citizenship in broad daylight and with a tweet. So my idea of flexible citizenship is presupposes a reality where incompleteness is embraced, and not as a lack. And I can see where you're coming from. Those who thrive for completeness develop all sorts of technologies and strategies for imposing hierarchies of being and belonging as a way of ensuring that they can continue to delude themselves and others that that completeness is attainable. But once you disabuse yourself of the possibility even of completeness, which is all about to subscribe to completeness is actually to subscribe to violence and violations of various kinds. It's about a certain rigid template which precisely makes Africa to appear as a lack. And no amount of bending over backwards to the point of contortion can make you outgrow the lacks that have been you have been landed with. Because the idea is not so much that you lack, but you are being made to feel that you lack. And I think, so my flexible citizenship is predicated upon recognizing and providing for incompleteness as something to celebrate, not something to be guilty about, as being human in every way. And in many ways, the environment and other instances of our being that we have tended to disparage will be all the better for it, because the problem is that we as humans define not only ourselves and our relationships among ourselves, but we even define the non-humans in ways that do not do our own existence any good. And I think that brings me to Shannon's question about the pandemic. And it's true that the pandemic in many ways has reaffirms some of the challenges that we continue to experience, not only in Southern Africa, but globally. We have and some of us perhaps even more than others, like we in Africa have always found it very difficult in a world where completeness is taken as a template and as a possibility. We have found it very difficult to move on, and at least move on our own terms. And then COVID comes and behaves like a very elite disease. It moves nonstop. It crosses borders without passports, just like Cecil Rhodes. It humbles all parts of every geography in the world. It humbles every class and every possible space imaginable. Yet, it imposes the very things that we are all too familiar with. Close lockdowns and closing of borders and so on and so forth. And in this case, the lockdown is even worse because you are hemmed into your own little space, your house or your shack or whatever. You're just completely immobilized. So in a way, COVID teaches us a lesson about the obsessive control of mobility and limiting it only to an elite few. That's one level. At another level, it it behaved in a very opportunistic manner to the hierarchies of humanities and the inequalities, and it's exacerbated the pandemic of inequalities and the pandemics of poverty, and now we have a pandemic of vaccines lack and so on and so forth. So it has surfaced and brought almost like beamed the torch light on the things that continue to plague us because of this zero-sum approach to belonging and to citizenship and these hierarchies of being and belonging and the idea that completeness is possible. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor. I would now like to open it for open it for the Q&A. So if you have a question, please raise your hand and we will ask you to unmute yourself. In the meantime, I have the privilege to ask a question because I'm the chair. So, Professor, I really kept thinking about what would have happened, if Rhodes didn't fall. And as he represents the ways in which settler colonialism still lingers, and I think it's quite ironic to think about the ways he's spoken about outside of South Africa, perhaps as a businessman or a benefactor, by those who actually ignore the ways in which the remnants of empire linger today. And I think it's quite interesting to think about the Rhodes House at Oxford, for instance, and how it houses and nurtures African scholars at the heart of the empire and at the heart of a neoliberal higher educational speciality. But also thinking about how those opportunities are unique opportunities which students wouldn't necessarily refuse. And I think as we attempt to gain legitimacy through sometimes an education that doesn't necessarily humanizes us, my question is, how do we actually reconcile a pursuit of knowledge by accepting financial legacies which are embedded in these remnants of conquest? And as we think about or as we take into consideration the legacy of incompleteness of a man like Cecil Rhodes and his entitlements. And I think it goes beyond Rhodes as we think about capital flows today.
It's a very good question, but I'll just give you a snippet of an answer. What I find attractive about embracing incompleteness as a framework for understanding and relating and even framing our questions and research is that you don't get too carried away by what might appear to be the end of a system or the end of say, Rhodes. Because in many ways, as long as we continue to operate within a system that overtly or even through indirections continue to perpetuate the idea that completeness is possible, that is possible to attain supremacy and be permanently, if you are dealing in terms of hierarchies, on top of the hierarchy and so on. It's possible to turn the tables and do away with Rhodes and have things all normal or decolonized. It is often that when we operate within that template of completeness, we delude ourselves with what might appear to be an end, which only to realize that Rhodes did not fall, and that Rhodes is beyond falling, that Rhodes cannot fall. So the sooner we embrace the idea of incompleteness and the mobility that makes us possible as humans and as systems or as institutions or whatever, then we can begin to be more realistic in the sort of equality and justice that we seek. If we borrow the wrong lessons from Rhodes, And we chase roads away, or at least a statue away, and then we maintain the nation state with all its contradictions, which is a system of arranging our affairs as a people or as a society, inspired by the world that roads represented. Then no amount of falling of roads would, symbolic falling of roads would undo roads. So, in fact, I may not have reflected enough in the book, but other things that I've written since the book, such as drinking from the cosmic gourd, how Amos Tutuola can change our minds. I have carried this reasoning of incompleteness further to make the case that in many ways we continue to nibble at resilient injustices and resilient hierarchies of being human, if we do not take incompleteness seriously, not as a negative, but as a template for relating in an interconnected world. We're nothing short of a cosmopolitan. And cosmopolitanism, last week, I think Polongo Tonji presented and drew us to an aspect of cosmopolitanism that always tends to be underemphasized, about the endogenousness of being African, which basically means cosmopolitan indigeneity, if you like. I think cosmopolitanism for us is not simply appreciated when Africa is dealing with Europe or the West.
Thank you, Professor. That's definitely a lot to digest for me personally. Sanya Osha had his hand up before Lydia, and I would like to invite Sanya to ask his question.
Thank you so much, Amina, for the opportunity. I just wanted to ask Professor Nyamnjoh, one issue has been referred to a number of times, but I just want you to speak a bit more on it. The association of roads with Amakwerekwere. Why this association with Amakwerekwere? You know, I find it quite intriguing. So I wanted to know the background and what you were trying to prove by associating his figure with the notion of Amakwerekwere. Thank you.
Yeah. If you the idea of the stranger who crosses borders into a cultural community, or a community that with shared values and shared practices, is usually, however, whether we look up to you or we look down on you, is considered as an outsider. And an outsider is often labeled in particular ways as outside of those who are included and called upon to partake of whatever shared community, sense of community that we may have. And if you see an outsider who comes with superior technology and is able to impose the will, is nonetheless an outsider, only a very powerful one, who can turn the tables on, to quote Catlejo, the true sons and daughters of the soil. Because of superior technology, a settler can become a native and chase all natives into settlers. But when the idea of Makwerekwere or Kwerekwere is used in relation to Africans by South Africans, it is actually used in the understanding that we as insiders do not even allow you the opportunity to use your superior technology to turn the tables on us. So so my argument is that if someone doesn't lose the outsiderness simply because they have superior technology and are able to turn the tables on the sons and daughters of the soil. That is just an outsider who is able to cross borders and insinuate themselves and show their true colors thanks to the technologies for self-activation. So that did not blind. I didn't allow myself to be blinded by that dimension to take away the strangers or the outsider status from roads simply because they were aided and abetted by colonialism or superior technology of conquest.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. I would like to ask Lydia to unmute and ask her question, and then we will move to Nicodemus. We'll take questions in bulk because of time, and if you still have a question to ask, please do raise your hand through the Zoom option.
Thank you, Amina, and I'm honored actually to be able to ask Professor a question. Now, Professor, I think I'm used to other categories, so I have a slight problem understanding you fully, but I genuinely appreciate your work. Okay, after reading your book, I'm not able to actually define who a human person is, what a human person is. And I say this because I would like to be able to define that reality without apartheid, without colonialism, is it possible to get an independent definition? And then number two, I like this idea of incompleteness because I think I can use it in my research. But again, now here is my question. Do you mean incompleteness in attitude, in desires, in material poverty? Is it psychological incompleteness? I'm not sure which part of the human we can call incomplete. Then number three, mobility, another term that I would like to be able to use if you give me the permission. Because of my understanding of the human and humanness, I think I'm the one who has a problem. When you talk about mobility, do you mean mobility of the spirit, mobility of the psyche, emotional mobility or psychological mobility, or is it just physical mobility? And what bestows that sense of being and belonging? Because I may not move anywhere. I'm talking to you from Nairobi, Kenya. And the reality of Nairobi, Kenya, from reading your book, I realized is quite different from South Africa. Because we had our roads must fall, but believe it or not, those statues were removed by the colonial government, not by the post-colony. And in a sense, it happened without a lot of fracas. We have other issues that we deal with, not about coloniality. We have a short memory. Yet, we had apartheid-style government and practices, but we seem to have forgotten. My questions end there, and thank you for listening to me.
Okay. Thank you very much, Lydia. I think it's a very important question. What I could start by saying is that the human can be defined from different vantage points, and some settle for a minimalist idea of being human, and then they go with, for example, a biological definition of being human might inform certain disciplines and practices and so on. You are contented when you see somebody who looks human as you are used to seeing and relating with others in your context. A human can also be social and so on and so forth. But basically, my sense of using the human is that uh, 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 a human is produced uh, even as you have the natural attributes of being human. You are produced through encounters and relationships with others, whether these be fellow humans or these be the natural environment with which you are in constant interaction, or if in religious terms you have reaching out in a suprasensory fashion to other forms of being that you feel gives you the fulfillment that you need to have a balanced life. But when I talk about incompleteness, I say that however, whatever our definition of human is, let's take just the biological and the importance of the senses that we claim to have as all five senses. You realize that when you do tests of a very chemical and scientific nature, it is very rare to have anyone who has all the senses 100% of each sense. And some fall short by 40%, 20% of a particular sense, and so on. And if you are doing research like we tend to work together in doing field work in anthropology and so on, then you realize that some of your colleagues are more are sharper in some senses or more endowed in some senses than you are. Then it makes sense for you to work as a team, a research team, rather than working in a lone ranger fashion, as anthropology as a practice has tended to encourage. So all the more reason, if you take incompleteness seriously and you're going to the field, then you have to be sure that in terms of sensory perception, you maximize your chances in the field by if you fall short on one sense, you make sure you take a colleague who can hear better or who can smell better than you, or who can touch and feel better than you, and so on. So basically, if we do not take our biological or social categories for granted, if we take seriously knowledge as a constant interrogation of what we have been provided with initially, then we ensure that a certain alertness to incompleteness, and we are able to correct it through relationships of various kinds. And that is where I'm driving at. And so the idea of incompleteness is a template that can apply both to the individual person, to cultural systems, to various forms of relationships and civilizations, and so on and so forth. So basically, the humility, grounding our thinking and our questioning around the humility of incompleteness, and that it is something to always work to surface, and not to feel uncomfortable about it because you are likely to be classified as inferior.
Thank you, Professor. I would now like to ask Nicodemus to turn on his camera and ask his question. And that would be our last question for today. I think it's quite sad that these seminars are only 1 hour long. We look forward to being in Cape Town and continuing the conversation in person for sure.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed for allowing me to take the floor. I enjoyed listening to Francis very much. I've read his book, and I'm full of praises for him. The reason being that he has helped to fertilize young minds, arm them with a new and a refreshing way of approaching a topic which looks complicated and perhaps incomplete. So I believe by reading him seriously, we'll be able to have a more complete view of these issues. Now, Roads Must Fall is a book that captures the mood of the time. It enables us to rethink the notion of belonging, of completeness, incompleteness, of insider and outsider. It is about inclusion and exclusion. Now, I have a very short question for the professor. How can this notion of inclusion and exclusion be integrated as mainstream and acceptable South African history? How can we accept roots as parts of African history? Nowadays, we're talking about decolonization. We're talking about usable history. We're talking about history in which everybody identifies himself, history that is complete. And in the spirit of completeness, I'd like the professor to tell us where we are going to keep roads, CC roads. The second and very brief one is an observation. I enjoyed the professor's book very much. And when I look at the Nigerian context, we realize that if we take the elements, the variables in South Africa, and we place them in Nigeria, it will produce a totally different result. It will not be something like what you find in South Africa. What we call xenophobia in South Africa, if you bring the same elements in the context of Nigeria of more than 200 million people, it's not going to produce xenophobia, it's going to produce something totally different. So there is the South African specificity, and the more you read the professor's book, the more you realize that although South Africa is part of Africa, South Africa is South Africa with a difference. Thank you, Professor. And thank you, Chairperson.
Thank you very much, Nicodemus, for a question that I can't possibly do justice to. And unfortunately, we are dealing in a context where we experimenting with incompleteness as the way to be and even to address issues in our conversation here. But I would say that one way of making roads part of Southern African history and part of history in general is it's only possible within the template of incompleteness. In the template of completeness and decolonization, what we would like to have is a total rupture with roads, and rupture with a big R. Rupture not only with roads the person, but rupture with what roads stood for. Ruptures with other things that he celebrated and that are part of today's world and part of today's economy and ways of being. Consumerism, and all the like, and so on and so forth. So if we settle for total rupture because we want completeness, then roads will not be part of Southern African history. But if we embrace incompleteness as the norm, then we're ready to examine, scrutinize roads, do away with all his excesses, and take on board and be proud of it what we thought enhances us without us having to be apologetic about getting something from somebody who could be that cruel, who could be that violent, who could be that disparaging to our humanity. That's one. And just for one, very quickly, those of us who have a clear case in Southern Africa to be disparaging, to dispose of Rhodes, to remove Rhodes, not to want to have anything to do with him, at the level of the way he treated us and was very condescending to our humanities, must at the same time, if we happen to be those who take seriously human rights and freedoms and sexual rights and freedoms, then we must grant it to Rhodes that he was one of the pace setters in terms of sexual freedoms in Southern Africa, that today we could borrow a leaf from him to realize that gays and lesbians and LGBTQ people can freely exercise their sexuality, because he was one of the pace setters in that regard. So somebody that you may find despicable at one level, suddenly you turn around and you see, he was a pace setter. I couldn't have done better than him in terms of promoting these freedoms. So at one level, it speaks to the idea of incompleteness as a disposition, and that goes hand in hand with humility, and that nobody has the final answers, and that knowledge production and being human is a convivial, a convivial pursuit, and you just contribute as much as you can without wanting to win in absolute terms. And I agree with you that once South Africa reaches a level and embraces this idea of incompleteness, then it begins to reach out to what the rest of the continent has to offer in terms of the own experiences of incompleteness, mobilities, and the interactions with one another. And those conversations of a Pan-African nature and would flourish, and soon people from elsewhere would begin to borrow a template from us, that this acknowledging incompleteness is not to feel guilty or to confirm your status as a savage.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Nicodemus, for your question. I liked your metaphor. And I agree with you. Professor Nyamnjoh has fertilized our minds and the minds of my generation. So thank you for that, Professor. And I'm very happy and delighted that Professor Nyamnjoh joined us today for this conversation, and for Shannon and Katleho for their contributions and critical insights. And I'm afraid that we're coming to the end of this seminar. So I would like to thank everyone who joined us today. I would also like to thank my colleagues Mimi and Azza for organizing today's seminar. Next week, we're having another Hima book lunch with Mahosi Malangu on his book, Our Food, Our Heritage, Our Future. And there are also other seminars happening this week at the Institute. And I think it would be a great continuation of the conversation, because tomorrow we're talking about feminism, modernity, and being human in contemporary Africa with Desiree Lewis and SN Nyek. So make sure you check out Huma's website and Twitter or Facebook to find the details to join us tomorrow. Thank you, Professor. Thank you for your time and your generosity. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.